in starting that epidemic, and they keep it going to this day. That's not news. We knew it a long time ago. And yet somehow the epidemic kept getting worse and worse as lawmakers and regulators did almost nothing to stop it. Why was that? Well, one reason was because OxyContin inventor Purdue Pharma showered money on a lot of people in Washington, including one of America's top conservative think tanks. You've already guessed, they're not that conservative. We profiled that relationship in detail in this program a short time ago. It is a shocking story that you should know. Here it is. Close to 50,000 Americans died from opioids last year. That's about one death every 10 minutes. You almost never hear anyone in power talk about what's happening, but it's changing this country forever. Communities are collapsing. Entire zip codes are being depopulated. Opioids have fueled the single deadliest public health crisis in our lifetimes by far. How did this start? Well, it started with men in lab coats, Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. When OxyContin was introduced, Purdue claimed without any evidence at all the users of it were unlikely to become addicted to the product. That was a lie that caused an epidemic. OxyContin and other painkillers turned out to be terrifyingly addictive. Many hundreds of thousands of Americans have entered into a death spiral of addiction after being prescribed these drugs by doctors. The disaster began more than 20 years ago, and yet only now is Purdue Pharma collapsing under the weight of a wave of lawsuits. How did the company get away with this for so long? Well, the answer tells you so much about how the propaganda machine works in modern America. Having made billions destroying an entire generation, Purdue Pharma used some of those profits to pay for good publicity, and boy, did they get it. Some of the PR budget went to nonprofits in Washington. According to reporting by ProPublica, from 2003 until very recently, Purdue Pharma gave $50,000 a year to the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a conservative think tank in Washington, one of the richest. The money turned out to be very well spent. For about the price of a car, Purdue Pharma bought years of positive coverage from AEI that helped the company escape scrutiny for the many deaths it was causing at the same time. In 2004, for example, an AEI scholar published a piece in the New York Times lamenting the plight of doctors who risked jail time for overprescribing painkillers. The article cited a study showing that OxyContin abuse was almost non-existent among those who'd been prescribed the drug. Well, as it turns out, the study was conducted and paid for by Purdue Pharma researchers. Yet the article didn't mention that fact, that key fact. It also didn't mention the fact that the piece had been coordinated directly with the drug company. Emails show that AEI's scholar, the one who wrote the piece, sent a draft of the article to Purdue Pharma's chief lobbyist a month before the article came out, seeking his approval of the text and making certain it didn't seem too blatantly pro-Purdue. Pretty stealthy. In 2007, that same AEI scholar wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal entitled Oxymoron. The piece briefly chastised Purdue for over-promoting its drugs. But then, and this was the real point of it, it described OxyContin as, quote, a godsend, and worried that physicians might not prescribe the drug in sufficient quantities. The problem with OxyContin, in other words, is that America doesn't have enough of it. As for the many people who are starting to drop dead from OxyContin, the article dismissed them as, quote, committed substance abusers. The year that article appeared, 18,000 people died of opioid overdoses. That was more than double the number for just a few years before. The epidemic was starting to rage out of control. And yet, according to AEI's expert scholar, quote, the real public health damage here comes from the pitched campaign by zealous prosecutors and public interest advocates to demonize the drug itself, end quote. Again, according to AEI, the real crisis was the fact that not enough Americans were taking OxyContin. This was, in effect, ad copy, no different from a glossy insert touting the life-enhancing benefits of some new consumer product. Except in one way, one key way, it was very different. Readers had no idea it was an ad for OxyContin. They assumed it was what it claimed to be, scientific research by a well-respected free market think tank, AEI. There was no mention of funding from Purdue Pharma. AEI kept that information to itself. Meanwhile, thousands kept dying, many, ironically, in this country's reddest states. So a conservative think tank ran interference for a company whose products were disproportionately killing conservatives. Yeah, just another day in Washington. If you're starting to suspect that the conservative establishment doesn't really represent your interests, there's a reason for that. They're every bit as corrupt as you think they are. Donations to corrupt Washington think tanks like AEI kept Purdue Pharma safe for a long while, but the Sacklers couldn't run forever. Now the company is finally collapsing under a wave of lawsuits. The Sackler family has offered to settle all the suits against them. Sadly, if that offer holds up, it means the family will never receive the justice it so richly deserves. We profiled this settlement recently. When the company released that drug, they claimed that it would be less addictive than other opioid medications. That was a lie. At some point, Purdue Pharma knew it was a lie, but they kept telling it, and multitudes died as a result. OxyContin turns out to be terrifyingly addictive. It has helped drive a drug epidemic in this country that has killed more Americans than any conflict since the Second World War. We now know that Purdue Pharma understood exactly what they were doing. Recent legal filings have exposed internal communications within the company, and they showed that the company's sales staff were pressured to sell as many pills as they could without regard to the risk. Physicians were urged to prescribe the highest possible doses of the drug in order to maximize profits. When evidence emerged that people were becoming junkies as a result, Purdue Pharma responded by shaming the patients they had hooked on their drug. They called them degenerate criminals, essentially, while refusing to take any responsibility at all for the human carnage they caused. It's hard to imagine an uglier story. Throughout all of it, we should note, Purdue Pharma's owners, the Sackler family, grew spectacularly rich. Looking back, repulsively rich. Earlier this year, the Sacklers were estimated to have more than $12 billion in the bank. Thanks to the opioid epidemic, the Sackler family is now one of the 20 richest families in this country.
I want to stop right there. One of the 20 richest families in this country. Now, one may say, whenever they hear that statistic, my God, these people are monsters. Using them and them alone for an scapegoat pertaining to all the problems that we're now facing. Guess what, folks? It's not just them. It's not just them. If you look at it realistically, what actually caused the demand for this supply was based around what had occurred in 2008 pertaining to the bubble burst. When the bubble burst happened, and for some unknown reason, to this day, I still haven't found out yet why crude oil went to over $5 a gallon going in people's tanks on a national average. And in some places was over $5 a gallon. Out in California, I know it was over $5 a gallon. Out in places like Colorado, I know it was in places over $5 a gallon. That was what caused a collapsation to our economy that we still today have not yet got over. Any time the politicians fail pertaining to the manufacturing communities of bringing good, decent jobs to our communities, any times that starts failing, people resort to these type of measures. Your taverns, your bars, your nightclubs, your drug activity, all of it picks up because people feels like that they're basically just whistling Dixie. In 2008, whenever the bubble burst happened, I was out here struggling towards going from community to community to state, from city to city, basically being a storm chaser. I've told my viewers this before, pertaining to how that I was surviving, and I wasn't doing necessarily PDR work, paintless dip repair work, and I wasn't necessarily being what you'd call a storm chaser towards filming bad tornadoes. I was going in behind a catastrophe and working for body shops and basically raking the cream off the top. I hate to use that analogy, but that's basically what the best way that I can describe it. Raking the cream off the top towards working there for as long as 6 months, maybe even a year, or almost a year, until all the work wound up steadily going away. And then whenever there wasn't nothing else left pertaining to the workforce, then I went to the next catastrophe. And that was the only way that I could survive during this time, because it was in 2005 whenever my life got turned totally upside down, of being attacked through my ex-wife and being attacked by the authorities here in Weakley County towards trying to promote me as me being some sort of a homegrown terrorist. Since 2005 up to 2014, I was on the road for about 7 or 8 years, basically living like a gypsy, living out of my toolbox, living out of extended stay suites. And a lot of times I would have to sleep either in my automobile or sleep in my utility trailer, or even sleep outside up underneath my truck, or just sleep outside on the parking lot, depending upon where I was, depending upon what time of the year that it was, whether or not it was super, super cold or super, super hot. But that was the way that I was surviving for about 7 or 8 years. And then I come back home in 2014, and I realize the consequences in pertaining to the bubble burst. And it's not just this community around here that resorted to drugs and alcohol because all their jobs had left. I think it was only up until this year that the state of Tennessee has finally decided to go up on their minimum wage to about $11 or $12 an hour. The way that I read a report, I'm hoping that I read it right on my telephone. But whenever you have politicians that fail the people, regardless whether it be senators, congressmen, state representatives, judges, or sheriffs, or whoever, this is the aftermath towards what happens. Anybody would tell you whenever the economy is doing real, real good, your taverns and your bars and your nightclubs are doing real, real bad. But whenever the economy goes bonkers, goes the other way around, oh man, people go to drinking, people go to drugging, people go to doing all kinds of stuff that they ordinarily wouldn't be doing if they had a plan or a vision or hope towards a future pertaining to living like everybody else is living, towards working 40 hours a week, raising a family, having a dog, maybe a cat, having 2 cars, and possibly even a swimming pool. Whenever you break that bond, that labor bond, this is the results of it. And that's exactly what happened. And I guess it was all kind of destabilizing from what happened during 9/11. 9/11 really shook us up real bad. Real bad. And things started getting wish-washy pertaining to the economy and this and that. And of course it really got tough there along about the bubble burst whenever young Bush had to borrow $775 billion, which is a little less than $1 trillion, to bail out the banks and all the car manufacturers and some of the other big companies that they bailed out. And to this day, they still don't know where all that money went. Got gobbled up by the rich, by the 1%ers. In the meantime, while people were suffering, didn't have jobs, had to go and pay late fees for this and late fees for that, and their interest rate went from an average 8% up to maybe 14 or 15 or 16%. Everybody's struggling. And who's making the money? The lawyers. The system is still making the money. People shuffling around a little bit of paperwork. the judges, the lawyers, stuff like that is still making the paper, still making the money. In the meantime, their salaries don't decline. They go up while everybody else's is going down. Yeah, you jump gasoline up to $5 a gallon again and see if it don't have the same effect upon to the American people. Whoever done that, or why ever that happened, should be held accountable for one of the worst catastrophes that has ever put America where it is right now today. And that's the reason why the opioid problem becomes such of a problem, because there was such of a demand for that entity. Whenever you take away this, for one action, always results to another action. Who was it that Einstein that made that equation? For every action is a reaction. Well, there you go. We want to blame the Sackler family, which they are. They're at fault, and by and large, they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But you gotta look at the big picture. Don't just look at the narrow picture. Look at the big picture. What put everybody in jeopardy to the degree that people was resorting to drugs? People were either go to nightclubs and bars and taverns. It was like, 6 months to a year after 9/11 happened. Man, the churches got filled up. They automatically got filled up. People was going to church thinking, oh my God, it's the end of the world. It's the end of the world. Something's going on. We're being attacked. We're being invaded. And we was being invaded. But what the people didn't see is that we was being invaded by fear. We was being invaded in other areas that no one paid any attention to. It's very easy to see 2 airplanes fall out of the sky and cause two massive buildings to fall out and to crumble and to collapse in New York City. You can see that. Even a blind man can see that. But to see all these other areas that has been caused since then. Once more, who masterminded 9/11? There you go. This spiritual demonic warfare that we're still all in towards this invasion has not stopped. It has crippled us, folks. We're $23 trillion in debt. You just heard the man tell us about his statistics towards somebody is overdosing every 10 minutes. Somebody is dying every 10 minutes in America pertaining to these drugs. And of course, a lot of this stuff is coming from Mexico over across the border. And some of it's coming in the mail pertaining to what's happening over in China. So it's a formula of catastrophe. It's almost like the perfect storm. Whenever you have one ingredient that formigates into another ingredient, and the next thing you know, you have a bunch of ingredients that's now causing what we're going through.
In the last few years, Purdue Pharma has faced a wave of lawsuits from the people in places devastated by its pills. Now, apparently, the company has made a settlement offer. To resolve all of these outstanding lawsuits, Purdue Pharma is willing to pay $12 billion. $3 billion of that would come from the Sackler family, which would then give up control of Purdue Pharma. That sounds like a lot of money. Well, let's put it into some perspective. The massive tobacco settlement of 1998 totaled about $206 billion. Now, no one would defend cigarette smoking. Over time, it will kill you. But Marlboros don't cut down young people in their prime. Smoking doesn't turn teenagers into zombies. It hasn't destroyed entire towns throughout the Midwest and New England.
Right.
The Sacklers are hoping to get off with just 6% of what the tobacco companies paid more than 20 years ago.
Right.
That feels wrong. But it's easy to see why the Sacklers are for it. According to Bloomberg, the Sacklers would retain at least $1.5 billion after the settlement. Is that justice? No, it's not. But unfortunately, it's a now familiar pattern in American life. A ruling class gets incredibly rich by wrecking our country, in this case by killing many thousands of young people. They get caught doing it, details emerge. Everyone in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles spends a week pretending to be horrified and concerned. And then nothing happens. Not a single one of the perpetrators ever goes to jail. Nobody's ever really punished. You've seen it again and again, including in the financial crisis of 2008.
There you go.
End, and in this case, they take their blood money and they head to St. Bart's for Thanksgiving and they laugh. They get away with it every single time. For once, it would be nice if people like the Sacklers got what they deserve. It might make the rest of us a little less cynical. What could and should Congress be doing to finally curb the epidemic of overdoses and suicides in this country? Nobody in Washington cares. They should. We'll speak to one Republican senator who does. Next.
It's keto friendly.
Sandals.
Welcome back to our special presentation on sobriety. According to a new report by the Senate's Joint Economic Committee, deaths from alcohol are now at their highest level since prohibition became law a century ago. Suicides have risen dramatically as well. Taken together, suicides, drug ODs, and alcohol deaths have been dubbed deaths of despair, for obvious reasons. If the numbers tell us anything, it's that America has more despair than at any time in the last century. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri is paying attention to this, despite the fact almost nobody else is. We talked to him recently. What do these numbers tell us, do you think?
They tell us that we have a crisis on our hands, Tucker. It's a crisis of hope in many places. Like in my state of Missouri, I just spent a number of days traveling across the state, talking to some of the most economically distressed or visiting some of the most economically distressed areas. And I can tell you every single person who I talked about the meth epidemic that is overwhelming the state, talked about suicide. I remember meeting one guy in a coffee shop who was wearing a wristband that said, "Talk to me." And I said, "What's that for?" And he said, in their little town, they had multiple teen suicides just in the last year. It's everywhere. It's a crisis.
I mean, I think you could count alcohol, cirrhosis deaths, drug ODs, in some cases diabetes, type 2 diabetes. But they're all forms of suicide. They're deaths of despair. As we said in the intro, why is almost nobody in Washington mentioning this? I can't remember this being brought up at the Democratic debates, for example. Why?
Yeah, well, what the Democrats are talking about is banning plastic straws and banning cows, open borders. Part of it is, Tucker, is that the elite consensus that drives Washington has driven the establishment on both sides has helped cause this problem. Things like immigration that has kept wages down for too long in this country. Things like free trade, supposedly, that's actually been unfair trade that sent jobs overseas away from these communities that are struggling. And then, of course, the drugs. The drugs are pouring across the southern border. That's where almost all the meth in this country is made. It's made in Mexico. It comes across the southern border, but neither establishment has wanted to do anything about it. And that's one of the reasons we have the crisis that we do.
It's hard to imagine this happening to any group outside of rural America and it being ignored. I'm not a conspiracy nut, and I'm not alleging a conspiracy, but it just seems obvious. If the life expectancy of Syrian refugees were in steep decline, there would be a page one New York Times editorial about it.
Yeah, these are people who often they don't have a voice. They get overlooked by the self-appointed mainstream media, as you say. And by the way, yes, it's rural America, but it's black, it's white. It's working people who are working hard every day, trying to make ends meet, trying to make it for their families, can't afford their health care, can't get treatment, can't get a good job. And again, what's the media focused on? Whether cows contribute to climate change. This just shows you that we need a wake-up call in Washington, D.C. The D.C. establishment has totally failed. If this isn't proof, Tucker, of the total failure of the politics of the D.C. establishment, I don't know what would be.
When your people start dying by the hundreds of thousands and you don't notice, there's something, your democracy is not functioning correctly, I think. Yeah, bless you for bringing this up. I really appreciate it, Senator. Thank you. And thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Because American elites, like AEI and the Sacklers, stood aside or actively enabled it, the addiction epidemic became a crisis of unprecedented proportions, the worst in the history of this country by death toll. That in turn is driving depression, suicide, and more social pathologies. Very few people are thinking deeply about why this is happening, but Johan Hari is. Hari is the author of the book Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression. He joined us earlier this year. The first step to getting sober is wanting sobriety, and I think we're too rarely reminded why that's something we should want. Why is it?
You know, I came to this. Sorry, I'm finding a little bit emotional to talk about. Sorry. You know, I came to this subject because we had a lot of addiction in my family, like you and I have talked about before, Tucker. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I didn't understand why then, but as I got older, I realised we had addiction in my family. And I remember really thinking, why do the more than one person in my family, why do they not want to be sober, right? And I think a lot of people who have addiction problems are asking themselves, that anger that I felt towards the people I loved was also something that they felt towards themselves, right? Why don't I want to be this? And speaking to lots of people who have addiction problems, and then obviously for my book Chasing the Scream, interviewing the leading experts in the world and looking at the best science on this, what I learned is the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be.
Right.
If we want to understand why, for example, people are using painkillers, we've got to understand why they're in such pain. So the core of addiction is trying to avoid deep psychological pain. That's not generally the story we're told about addiction, right? The story we're generally told in our culture is, oh, either you partied too hard, you indulged yourself, and then you just got taken over by the drug, or that you become obsessed with the kind of chemical hooks. This is why we call it being hooked, right? This is actually, that's real, but it's actually a very small part of addiction.
Right.
Most of what's going on is about trying to avoid deep pain. So when we think about sobriety, I think one of the most
And I want to emphasize, whenever you're talking about somebody that's 2 or 3 payments behind on their automobile payments, and they're fixing to lose their automobile, that's pain. That causes pain. Whenever you're talking about somebody that the financial institution is fixing to foreclose on, and they're fixing to become homeless, to now, instead of buying a home, now they're either going to have to rent a home or just go live with somebody or become a homeless person, that causes pain. That causes a very, very emotional pain whenever you cannot make ends meet. Who is to blame for this? The politicians of the American government, the prior past 3 or 4 administrations that sat idly by and did not keep their eyes on the ball pertaining to NAFTA, free trade, pertaining to fair trade. And I do want to give Trump 2 thumbs up because he has recognized this problem, and it's a gross cancer to American society that is causing so much pain pertaining to people losing their 401ks and losing their hope. Hope means a whole lot to a society, and whenever you take that hope away, what's the next best thing that people do 9 times out of 10? Unless they're really, really strongly grounded in a spiritual relationship with God, the next best thing is to take opioids or to drink or to lose consciousness to the point that you no longer have to deal with that pain. My brother, Danny, my older brother, done the exact same thing pertaining to the pain that was going on with our father, pertaining to his post-traumatic stress that he created from being in war. The problem with my older brother is that it becomes such of an obsession with him towards drinking Milwaukee's Best and any other thing that he could drink to guzzle it down to once more end the pain. The hops in the beer, his body had a chemical reaction to the hops, and the next thing you know, his fingernails was falling out, he was having sores, and he was having all kinds of rashes come up on his body, and my brother thought, well, if I drink more beer, it'll make that pain go away too as well. And it was counterproductive. The more that he would drink, the more the hops would cause his liver to fail. The more his liver failed, the more he had these problems pertaining to all these other outbreaks that was happening in his life. And it was just, according to my brother David, it was one of the most horriblest deaths that he'd ever seen anybody die, because he didn't die a quick death. It was a very, very slow, agonizing death that David had to sit idly by and watch on a day-to-day, everyday occurrence with his older brother. And it literally broke David down emotionally to the point that then the pain becomes so obnoxious. I don't know, maybe David started doing the same thing that his older brother was doing, pertaining to trying to take something or get something that would abolish the pain. Once more, you can't put a Band-Aid on your problem. The only thing that's going to truly help these alcoholics or these drug addiction people that are addicted is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the only thing that is going to truly start from the innermost parts of your being, your aura, and work it from the inside out to the point that you become healed. That's the only way that a person can truly get over this towards being a recovery alcoholic or a recovery drug addict. Other than that, you're just putting a rubber stamp or a Band-Aid on it, and you're just rolling it over to the next event, to the next event, to the next event, to the next event. And if anybody's ever seen anybody have this type of problem in their atmosphere, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about is in fact true. One thing leads to another. It's a dominoes effect. And it's very, very sad whenever people reach this state of hopelessness. It's very, very sad.
Important things we've got to do is ask ourselves, what are the conditions that we can create as a culture that will make more people be able to be sober, want to be sober? In a really painful reality, a lot of people will want to check out. Together we can change the reality. Look, it's not a coincidence, right? Why is addiction much, much higher in West Virginia than it is on the faculty of Harvard, right? There's not no addiction at the faculty of Harvard, but there's some, but it's radically higher in West Virginia. Through no fault of their own, the people of West Virginia have been stripped of some of their most basic psychological needs. They've been made unbelievably financially insecure. They've been humiliated at work. They've been made to feel really lonely. Now, we've got to deal with so it's not that people in West Virginia just turned out, as you know very well, Tucker. It's not that people in West Virginia.
I'm going to stop again and weigh in on this. I had no earthly idea that this conversation was happening. This is the first time that I've heard or seen any of it. But I'm going to reflect to Wheeling, West Virginia. Once more, it was the corrupt politicians of that era in the early 1990s that tried to stamp me as me being an assassin. That said that I had threatened George Walter Bush's life, Mr. Senior Bush's life. I never threatened Mr. Bush's life. And I'll be able to testify that one day up in the kingdom of God. Because I know the truth about what that I have said and being in touch with reality to the point of being held accountable. Because the corrupt politicians in West Virginia and West Virginia, has caused this problem to manifest upon to their own society, while the richest of the rich remain rich, while the powerfulest of the powerful remain powerful. And the same damn thing has happened right here in Weakley County, Tennessee. You got judges and sheriffs. You got a sheriff that's been inaugurated for 9 different times. 9 terms. He's probably got at least $3 or $4 million packed away somewhere, either in CDs or escrows or savings account. Ain't no telling what kind of home that he lives in. In the meantime, while all these people are suffering. and they act like they're confused, that they don't realize what's going on. Trust me, people like us, people like this guy right here, and other people, we know what's going on. The richest of the rich, the corruptest of the corruptest, has taken advantage. They have panhandled upon to the people. And because of it, it has left this nation in shatters. That's what's happened. That's exactly what's happened. In the meantime, they'll sit and deny every bit of it. Oh, we didn't have nothing to do with this. Oh, we didn't. Greed. Whenever all the jobs left or started to leave during the latter part of Bill Clinton's era, and whenever all that stuff started happening in the latter part of Bill Clinton's era pertaining to the impeachment trial and everything, all this was stepping stones leading to where we are now. You know, the Waco deal, the Oklahoma deal, the Ruby Ridge deal. All these was events that has led us down to the road of 9/11 and then the 2008 bubble burst and where we are today. But now you're narrow-minded people, you're small-minded people, even after listening to this program, even after listening to this, they still won't accept it because their minds cannot travel but only for a certain length of time. In other words, there's some of us that can go 2 miles on a gallon of gas. Some of us can only go a mile on a gallon of gas, and some of us can only go a half a mile on a gallon of gas. And then you got some people like us that can actually go 25 miles to the gallon on a gallon of gas. People are going to have to wake up and understand the dynamics of what has occurred here in the past 30 years, beginning all the way back into the Reagan era, towards passing the buck, thinking that we was going to be able to borrow from Paul and not have to worry about paying Peter back. Well, now it's come time to pay Peter whenever you're $23 trillion in debt and over 2.3 incarcerated either federal, state, or local prisoners or inmates in jail. Now it's come time to pay Peter back. But no one is willing to look at the real problem. But only a few of us, like this guy right here to your right, wearing the blue blazer.
Turned out to be kind of weak-willed, or
Let's back this up again. Let's listen to what he's got to say, because he's speaking the truth.
Through no fault of their own, the people of West Virginia have been stripped of some of their most basic psychological needs. They've been made unbelievably financially insecure. They've been humiliated at work. They've been made to feel really lonely. Now, we've got to deal with so it's not that people in West Virginia just turned out, as you know very well, Tucker. It's not that people in West Virginia turned out to be kind of weak-willed or, unable to maintain sobriety. It's that the circumstances of their life are so painful that so many people want to check out. We can deal with that. I've been to places that had crises as bad as what's happening in West Virginia now and turned it around. But it's all about changing the environment, right? Building an environment that people want to be present in and can bear to be present in.
I think that's really wise. And again,
and to be present in soberly minded, not presently in pertaining to being buzzed up. If you're buzzed up, you can kind of haze it. You can kind of shadow in the fuzzy math a little bit and say, oh, I ain't going to worry about it as long as they don't come out here and actually start taking my stuff out of the house and throwing it next to the road towards being evicted. I ain't going to worry about it until it actually happens. Well, see, that's what does happen whenever you don't take these things serious. Whenever you don't take these signs serious towards these red lights flashing, that's occasionally what happens. They actually come and take your stuff out of your apartment or out of your house and put it beside the road and say sayonara. And then whenever reality does hit these people, because up until that time, they've been kicking the can down the road towards not accepting reality, towards it being reality. But once more, whose fault is it in a lot of these cases, the reason why that those people couldn't afford to keep their payments? It goes back to what was prominent in the area pertaining to the jobs. I can drive around right now and find tombstone after tombstone after tombstone of factory after factory after factory that has been shut down. No longer has anybody even working in it. I don't even know how they're paying the taxes on the property. May have done already given the property up to the county or to the city. I don't know. Who wants to pay for taxes on a building? As a matter of fact, I know a lot of the buildings that they're paying people to actually go in and tear the buildings down. And a lot of them are salvaging the buildings towards getting all the metal and whatever copper or anything else that they can get out of the building in the expense of tearing the building down.
Something that not enough people are saying. Johan Hari, thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much, Tucker.
That's it for us tonight. We'll be back every weeknight at 8 p.m. Eastern, the show that is the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. Happy New Year. See you soon.
Now, see, I just got through putting out a letter today. Today's the 1st, 2020, January the 1st, that corresponds directly with this program that I was fortunate enough to get a hold of today that was recorded way before, or just about before, the first of the year, because he's telling everybody Happy New Year. So the information that I'm giving out corresponds directly with the information that he's giving out towards, it's not just the drugs, what caused the people to turn to the drugs. You got to go back to the politicians. The politicians is what has failed the American people in America, while people like China and other places thrived. And nobody caught it because everybody was having such of a good time. And now the working class and the poor class isn't no longer having a good time, but they're having a hard time. They're having a struggling time. But in the meantime, the people that put us in the situations that we're in are still being fed very, very well, with living in their nice homes, driving their nice cars, and having their big bank accounts. When is the American people going to wake up pertaining to this travesty that has happened not only to 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255, but has happened to the majority of the citizens of this great nation? When are the people going to wake up and realize what has occurred? What has occurred?